Mineral licks. What are they and why are they so important to wildlife?
I'm an assistant professor with ecosystem science and management at the University of Northern British Columbia, and I teach biology and forestry, and I study moose and mineral licks.
So what are mineral licks?
So a mineral lick, and I guess it's kind of a strange term to a lot of people, but it's basically a place, and there are natural ones and there are man-made mineral licks, but it's a place where, in the case of natural ones, there's bare earth that's exposed, and most of the time it's fine textured soils like we see here. That would be clays and the kinds of soils that would hold the properties that animals like moose seem to be interested in. We know that the earth has a lot of different minerals in it, and animals, unlike people, can't go to Costco and get a multi-mineral when they're lacking certain minerals in their diet. And so in that case, what they do is go straight to the earth, and they do this thing called geophagy, which really means earth eating. And they eat the mud and they drink the water that's muddy, and from that they get the minerals that they need to supplement what it is that they're lacking in their diet.
Does use of them vary by season, or is it pretty constant?
The use of mineral licks tends to vary by season and by species, and even within species by the sex and age class of the animal, but it tends to be at natural licks. What we see is that as long as they are available and not covered by snow and ice, you have a situation where they'll be used quite heavily in June and July. And then there's another little peak from earlier studies that we've done that indicates that they also use it in December and January. And what the physiology is behind that, what the mineral requirements are behind that, is still unknown. But yes, definitely in the summer, especially in the snow and ice-free period, June and July tend to be the times that moose will come in and use these mineral licks to access the minerals that they're lacking.
So what are some of the features you would look for that would tell you that you're at a lick?
Yeah, it's important to understand that this isn't just a mud hole, that there's something special about this mud hole. It's, number one, you can see completely covered in tracks, and this is just littered with tracks from moose and deer, maybe elk and caribou. It's hard to say until we got down on our hands and knees and looked at these. But the other characteristic is that you see that oftentimes, especially if it's a lick that's been used a long time, the surrounding vegetation and soil will be at a higher level than that which has been trampled and kind of rototilled by the animals. So you can kind of see that it's depressed in the area where there's mud and there's all the tracks. The other very definitive characteristic is that moving away from the lick, you'll have trails that radiate out into the woods in many different directions. And that is another very distinguishing characteristic between a lick and just a place where there's exposed muddy soils, is that there'll be trails going out. A lot of the vegetation along the trails will be covered with mud because as the animals are in here, they get muddy. And then so the vegetation leading off on the trails will all be darkened by the soils and stained by the soils. And the other thing is that there's all of these tracks.
So do most of the mineral licks have the same chemical composition, or does it vary across licks?
It really varies. The chemical composition between licks really varies, and it just depends on what are the parent materials, what's being provided to that particular. Usually it's associated with some kind of a seep. For moose, they tend not to just eat or consume dry soil. They like to have this muddy soil, and they kind of, from what I've seen over the years that I've studied this, they walk in the water, they disturb the water, they suspend the mud, and then they drink the water that has this kind of suspension of all of the soils and minerals in the water. There are some animals like sheep and goats and elk that will just eat dry soil, and deer do that as well, but moose tend to like these. Another name for mineral licks is muck licks.
Right,
because
it's wet.
It's wet, and they just like to come in and get access. But it really depends on the parent materials. It depends on what region you're in, because all of these, and we've looked at the mineral composition of many different licks, and they all vary slightly from one another.
Okay. One thing I was noticing over here was some browse of bark right here.
This is actually, to me, this looks like they were probably, And they don't visit licks very often in the fall, but this is probably a moose rubbing the velvet off of its antlers.
Oh, that's what it is.
Practicing a bit of rutting activity with this little young one. So what they'll do
Because I was seeing a lot of the bark on the ground.
Yes,
Okay.
definitely, yeah. And that wouldn't be a species, although moose will bark species and eat the bark, that tends to be cottonwoods and aspens and willows, not conifers. But this is just the right size that they would use to spar with and kind of clean up their antlers in the fall for the rut.
Looking at this mineral lick, this could only be used during the summer and not necessarily during the winter. So those are the differences in mineral licks. So you really need to observe the trails that come to these licks and document how often it's utilized, and that should indicate by the tracks that's also in the licks. And then one of the key things that's actually quite unique about this place is the small spring, which is actually being fed from underground. So these ones are really valued because they're really important. This is going to stay for a long time, and as long as it's not logged here, this will continue forever.
So coming to the lick, we can see a series of trails coming together.
That is actually a really good indicator for how the mineral licks are being utilized by the number of trails. The animals will come here from different areas, travel through here, and then they will maneuver back to other mineral licks. So this is why it's really important for that connectivity and to keep those connectivities protected, so that the animals always have a corridor to travel through from one lick to the next.
So when you're looking at a dry lick, what are you looking for? Is it sort of the hoof prints?
The tracks.
The tracks.
Yeah, because there's still tracks here.
Yeah, it goes right up, you can see.
And right in there. So this would be classified as a mineral lick because of the number of tracks that you see in this lick and how it's heavily utilized. It shows that the animals are coming in. And if you look at the vegetation, you can tell how long this has been used because some of the vegetation is quite high and it's been knocked down quite a bit. So this is the actual lick that they were talking about that's been around for a number of years. Yeah, you could see how high the vegetation is and how much the animals have knocked it down. This is actually fantastic.
And you can actually see the salt, which I know you can't always see it.
You can't always see it, but this one you do see it.
And there's a bit of an iron deposit right there.
Right in the middle.
That's also important.
Yeah. This is really good for ungulates because it helps the antlers grow, and also for the pregnant cows that come in. It really brings in the minerals for their fetuses. And you'll note that once the cow has its calves in the spring, they'll stick around the mineral lick to actually, so that the young calf gets its nutrients.
So what are we looking at?
Well, this is a moose summer dropping, and the way you can tell it's a moose summer dropping and not a cow. A cow tends to be a little flatter, a little more splattered out and just runnier. And the way you can tell it's not a bear is that everything in it is homogenized as if a smoothie would have gone through it. Whereas in bear scats, you would see chunks and berries and twigs and see that it's all homogenized, just like moose pellets. Except in the summer, they're not in pellet form. They're runny because they're trying to regulate their minerals.
So what are they eating in summer?
So here they're eating things like, well, at least a little farther south, down in the Chetwynd area, they're eating things like willow leaves, birch leaves. They're eating some bladderwort out of the water. They're eating fireweed. There's all kinds of things that they're eating. The thing is, in the summertime, they have a salad bar. They can basically eat anything that they want. And the analysis that we're doing, you know, it's kind of what's left in the poop that's made it through the digestive system. Probably things that are more digestible aren't really showing up in the fecal material. So the less digestible stuff shows up in the fecal material, the more digestible ends up probably getting mostly digested.
So what do we have here?
So we're at a very interesting and small mineral lick that appears to be something that moose are at least passing through in the winter. It's hard to say. They form these pellets probably anywhere between September and May, so they can still be coming to the lick before it gets really covered in snow and ice. But they will form these pellets as they move into that winter period when all of the forbs and the leafy vegetation start to give way to bark and twig diets, and then as they start to eat the bark and the twig and diets filled with more roughage, they form pellets, which are very different than the summer droppings. Winter diet, again, here I don't know what is going on here, but around Prince George it's really clear. It is subalpine fir, it's birch, paper birch probably mostly, and willow and aspen. Those are the top four. But licks can still be used throughout the year, and they will be used oftentimes if there's a mineral spring associated with them. As long as it's not frozen solid, they will use it right through the winter. So this is kind of a small lick in terms of the kinds of licks we're seeing on the landscape around here, but just because it's small doesn't mean it's any less important, because it might be the only one for several kilometers. And so even though it doesn't have a lot of water in it right now and it doesn't appear to be getting a lot of use, when this fills up with water and they can stir it up and kind of suspend these minerals in the water and drink the water, then it will be quite useful to them. It's made of the right soil types. It seems like it's got a lot of trails coming into it. And so even though we might have a hard time describing why this is important to moose, it doesn't matter how humans describe it. It appears to be important to moose because there's trails coming here. And even more fascinating, there's a little tiny, what appears to be a bit of a spring right here that has a really well-worn trail coming right to it. And that is going to be interesting to get photos and videos of, to see how it is that the animals are using that, because the trail stops right there at that little puddle. There must be something in it that's of great interest to moose.
Mineral licks are incredibly important wildlife features and should be protected along with the wildlife trails that connect them all.